Counter-Narrative News, bringing you daily news on Wednesday the 3rd of May 2023. The Moscow leadership and the Kremlin has reportedly suffered a missile strike by means of a flying drone. The missiles seem to have been intercepted by the Russian authorities, and they reported no injuries or fatalities. As a result, they quickly were to accuse the Kiev regime of carrying out this operation against them. Of course, the Kiev regime is the much smaller state, smaller by 10 times of the Russian state, which the Russian state has since February last year conducted its colonial campaign of invasion, occupation and annexation. When big, large superpower states in the world conduct massive violence and export it into smaller nations and occupied and oppressed peoples, often but not always, there is a violent response from those occupied. It's not always the case, but it may seem that this may be just that, following on from the killing of Daria Dugin, who is a daughter of a leading Russian neo-Nazi, Alexander Dugin. And Daria Dugina in her own right was a well-established far-right advocate as well. And it also follows just a few months ago the killing by means of a bomb in St. Petersburg of a well-known far-right military blogger in support of toxic Russian far-right nationalism as well. It remains to be seen what happens next. Of course, former Russian president and senior in the Russian Security Council, Medvedev, has claimed that, therefore, considering the attack on the Kremlin and the apparent attack to kill the Russian leadership, that the Russians have no option but to, quote-unquote, eliminate Zelensky. Let's see where all of this toxicity goes. On the Western imperialist hand, of course, especially the Scandinavian countries have stated their commitment ongoing, permanently, and in an unlimited way to support Kiev against its struggle against the invasion of its colonial neighbor. And also the Scandinavian countries want to fast-track Ukraine into membership of the greatest purveyor of violence on the planet, that is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Going over to Sudan, and very much the Sudanese people in Khartoum are a victim of this wonderful new multipolar world in which Russian and Chinese interests are vested in supporting one group of sordid death squads in the form of the Rapid Support Forces, and also supporting the Sudanese armed forces in the form of the leadership of General Burhan. Airstrikes are continuing in Khartoum despite this ceasefire and that ceasefire. One airstrike by the East Nile Hospital killed 3 people in the streets, 1 vendor and a child included. It's a very sad state of affairs, but it's important to study the case of Sudan, like Sri Lanka before last year, like Kazakhstan before last year as well, that to see what really this new multipolar world looks like for the oppressed people. More capitalist looting, more colonial capitalist supremacist violence, and no leadership to bring the oppressed out of all of this mess. Going to the celebration of, talking of toxic colonialism, the celebration through the coronation of King Charles III in Britain, or quote-unquote United Kingdom. Quite depressing sitting in a primary school today, watching the promotion of this disgusting feudal monarchist colonial racist celebration, that's the coronation, being shoved down the throats of primary school children, many of which, if not most of which, in urban centres in this country are from families who are historic or current victims of the very institution that the coronation seeks to celebrate, i.e. the leading political, cultural, economic entity of the British state for centuries, if not millennia, being the British monarchy. Very important that people counter oppose this, resist it, and treat it for the disgusting nonsense that it is. Finally, going over to Gary Foley in Australia, a long-standing liberation fighter at the grassroots for black Australians or native Australians, or however you want to call them, rejects totally in recent days the referendum in Australia that asked the population whether they are going to vote to have in the constitution a quote-unquote voice to parliament of native Australian people. Gary Foley has argued the fundamental problem in Australia, as is the case around the world, is a problem of what he calls Anglo-Australian racism, or white supremacy of the Anglo-Saxon variety, which arguably is one of the leading white supremacist kind of poles and powers in the world. Gary Foley correctly argues that no oppressed people and nation wants to be embedded in the institutions and in the superstructure of the colonizing power, and has argued, and he has quite a lot of substance in this argument, that there's been advisory bodies before. This is just another advisory body, and the danger is it takes away agency of the black Australian community and embeds it into the colonial state. Our commentary is that nothing but the black power radical mobilization of the masses of the grassroots is the only means to which to win any kind of concessions from the colonial entity, and going forward is the only path to liberation. Counter-narrative news wishes all of our audiences a wonderful day. Please continue to support us by encouraging your friends and contacts to follow our YouTube channel. We are also on Twitter at @counter_CNN. Lots of fantastic videos and playlists on our platform. Please peruse through and share. Many thanks.